let's get started. Um, Welcome back, or welcome if this is your first time. If you weren't here for part one, that's already uploaded onto the WeChat Project YouTube channel, and this will be recorded and uploaded as well, just the presentation part, not the discussion. So please join our Slack to receive notifications about the uploads. If everybody could share in the chat your name and where you're Zooming from. I'm Dora. I'm currently in New Haven, and I am a recruitment coordinator for the WeChat project.
Hi, everyone. I'm Claire. I'm in Madison, Connecticut, so 20 minutes away from Dora, and I'm also doing recruitment with her this summer.
Today's teaching is going to pick up with the Transcontinental Railroad, and it's going to finish around the 1970s. We're going to focus on tracing historical continuities to highlight racial and labor solidarity against empire. Some of you might be very familiar with aspects of the history we're doing today, and some of you might be hearing it for the first time. All of us are going to keep growing in our personal political trajectories as we all work towards developing the type of Chinese American organizing movement and politics that are really transformative. Before we begin, Claire and I would just like to share the sources that we've leaned on heavily for both of these teach-ins. We strongly encourage you to visit these sites on your own time to learn so much more than we could ever teach. Next week, our third teach-in is going to be on moving beyond the limits of Stop AAPI Hate. All of us are going to be discussing the challenges that we've noticed in Chinese America and Chinese American organizing, and we're going to brainstorm together how we can surmount those challenges. So without further ado, let's jump into Chinese American history part 2.
Cool. So we concluded last week's teach-in with the United States' gold rush. And in 1862, a new national project starts, the Transcontinental Railroad. And we are going to use historical events from throughout the late 19th century, including the building of the railroad, to help explain the concept of racial capitalism. For now, just keep in mind two things. The term racial capitalism is coined by a Black scholar, Cedric J. Robinson, and it argues that in order for capitalism to survive, it has to exploit and prey upon the unequal differentiation of human value along the lines of race. In the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, over 10,000 immigrant Chinese workers, like these men photographed, labored in the most dangerous jobs for the least amount of pay. And at the end of the completion of the railroad, the iconic golden spike picture, which celebrates the joining of both sides of the railroad in 1869, includes 0 Chinese workers, although they made up half of all the laborers on the railroad. Because this is the only picture shown in history textbooks and probably the only thing you were shown in your class if you even were taught about the railroad, our narrative of history exists in a very white supremacist framework. In the 1870s and to the 1890s, there was actually an economic depression in the US. So during this time, the employers of various large industries very consciously used Chinese replacement labor in sites of labor conflict. Chinese replacement labor was specifically opportunistic for capitalist businessmen because the Chinese were, quote, perpetual foreigners and also had no legal or political power to contest the conditions of their employment. Thus, these laborers were brought by white capitalists into Louisiana cotton plantations to discipline freed Black peoples. They were also brought into New Jersey to counter Irish washerwomen in laundries. And they were even brought into places like Massachusetts shoe factories to break workers' strikes, or into the coal mines of Wyoming to counter union organizing actions. And so this movement of cheap Chinese labor by the capitalist class generated the conditions for a full-blown anti-Chinese and anti-Asian movement. Outbreaks of anti-Chinese hatred, riots, and violent expulsions become common, especially in the West Coast. And during the Chinese massacre of 1871, which is the picture here, 18 Chinese men are lynched by a mob of over 500 people in Los Angeles. This event remains one of the worst lynchings in United States history and also is rarely taught in history classes. And anti-Chinese sentiment during this time comes to a head with the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. This law prohibits the immigration of Chinese laborers and was the first piece of federal legislation to specifically prohibit immigration on the basis of race. The only other legislation to do so in history is Trump's Muslim ban. And so all of these events, the underpaying of Chinese labor in the Transcontinental Railroad, the anti-labor use of Chinese laborers, anti-Chinese violence, and just in general, Chinese exclusion, these events all exemplify racial capitalism. And under white supremacy, racism creates wealth for the elites and difficult economic conditions for people of color. And the same capitalist forces that displace Chinese laborers are also pushing Chinese folk into urban ghettos or Chinatowns. So Chinatowns were and still are, on one hand, segregated, isolated, marginalized enclaves that receive second-class services and are perceived in the overall society as a collection of perpetual foreigners. But on the other hand, Chinatowns are also communities of common language, customs, interdependencies, and affinities. Chinese restaurants at this time cater to everyone and do not segregate clientele like white establishments did. And Chinatowns and these restaurants were examples of Chinese survival and resistance within racial capitalism.
Our second theme today is US imperialism and settler colonialism. The historical example we're going to use and start with is the Spanish-American War, which is often taught in US history classes as beginning when Cuba declared independence from Spain in 1895. When Spain crushed the Cuban resistance, the United States intervened, and by the end of the quote war, the US empire had defeated the Spanish Empire and took control of all of their colonies. They annexed the Philippines, Hawaii, Guam, and Puerto Rico, and made Cuba a quote protectorate. Happening during the same year domestically, the Curtis Act of 1898 broke up the tribal governments and communal lands of 5 tribes of the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Muskogee, Cherokee, and Seminole peoples. Indigenous tribes lost control of 90 million acres of their land. While the act intended to dissolve tribal courts, governments, and land claims, it ultimately failed in the face of Indigenous resistances. This image is from the 2017 film Te'ata, which describes the life of Mary Thompson Fisher, a Chickasaw woman who at every turn of her life resisted the colonialism of her Chickasaw culture. Indigenous people today continue to struggle for their sovereignty. I mentioned the Curtis Act of 1898 in conjunction with the Spanish-American War because imperialism and settler colonialism are tied together. Both entail the expansion of empire in search of land, labor, and wealth. Of 30 US generals who were in the Philippines during the Spanish-American War, 26 had been officers in the quote Indian Wars. For example, Major General Nelson A. Miles was a General Army commander in the Philippine War, and he had also been in charge of removing Sioux peoples to reservations during the 1870s, and he was in command during the Wounded Knee Massacre. The quote end of the Spanish-American War really just launched an era of US imperialism in the Pacific that continues today. Guantanamo Bay, which a lot of us have heard of, is located in Cuba and was acquired by the US during the Spanish-American War. It has been used as an active military base ever since 1898, and making it the oldest overseas US military encampment. Settler colonialism is a structure, not an event. It is a theory that helps frame how destroying, then taking Indigenous lands is a ceaseless, ongoing project. Likewise, imperialism is not an event. It is an ongoing structure. Since Claire and I have been alive, the United States has been at war in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and Pakistan. Between 1990 and 1997, there were over 30 US military interventions globally. The US has a permanent deployment of troops in South Korea, which is a legacy from the Korean War. There are about 50,000 US troops in Japan, which is rooted in the end of the World War II. In Guam, there are 5,000 US troops and naval fleets and nuclear submarines throughout the Pacific Ocean. US imperialism and settler colonialism is ongoing today.